There is very little truth in the old refrain that one cannot legislate equality.
Thurgood Marshall was an African-American lawyer who was instrumental in ending legal segregation and became the first ever African-American Supreme Court justice. Born on July 2, 1908 in Baltimore, Maryland, to Norman William Marshall, he was the grandson to a slave. Beginning in his youth, his father instilled in him an appreciation for the Constitution of the United States. He became very familiar with the Constitution after he was made to read and memorize it as a form of punishment for bad behavior by one of his teachers. After graduating from high school, Thurgood enrolled at Lincoln University, a historically black college in Pennsylvania. His inner circle of friends at this institution would prove to become important black figures including author and poet Langston Hughes, Kwame Nkrumah, who would be the president of Ghana, and the musician Cab Calloway. He married Vivienne Buster Bury just before graduation, and they were happily married for 25 years. Thurgood was denied admission to the first law school he applied to because he was black, the University of Maryland. He ended up attending Howard University Law School, but did not forget the unsettled feeling he had from being discriminated against for his race. This would eventually drive his career towards fighting for racial equality. While at law school, Thurgood was heavily influenced by his dean, Charles Hamilton Houston, who again reinforced the importance of the Constitution and its application to all Americans, regardless of race or color. Houston felt it was most important to overturn the 1898 Supreme Court ruling Plessy v. Ferguson, which had established the legal doctrine separate but equal. Inspired by and working alongside his mentor, Thurgood's first major case, known as Murray v. Pearson, was in 1934, in which he sued the University of Maryland Law School for refusing to admit Donald Gaines Murray, who was an intelligent African-American graduate of Amherst University. In 1936, the case was a success, and Murray was admitted. This was the same law school that had discriminated against Thurgood earlier.
What I say is that I have faith in the efficiency of the law. Perhaps that is because I'm a lawyer and not a missionary. But I think history, which proves so many things, proves me right.
After this, he moved to New York and became the chief counsel for the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, during which time he helped draft constitutions for newer African nations. He continues to fight for civil rights, taking cases like Chambers v. Florida and Smith v. Allwright to the Supreme Court. In Chambers v. Florida in 1940, he successfully defended 4 black men who had been convicted of murder solely based upon confessions which had been forcefully obtained by police. In Smith v. Allwright in 1944, his case resulted in the court deciding it was unconstitutional for the Democratic Party to use whites-only primary elections in southern states.
He believed fervently in the Constitution. He felt that that was the tool that would eventually make black people equal to whites in this country.
By this time, Thurgood's reputation was becoming widespread, and he had become the leader of the Civil Rights Revolution. He would go on to win 29 Supreme Court cases. He was named the director of the legal defense of the NAACP. Thurgood Marshall's greatest achievement and biggest legacy would be the landmark Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. It was a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of a group of black parents of children who were forced to attend all black segregated schools in Topeka, Kansas. In this case, he was able to challenge the legal doctrine brought about by Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, and therefore segregation in public schools violated the right to equal protection under the 14th Amendment. Brown v. Board of Education was the legal foundation that the American Civil Rights Movement was based on, and although it would take many years to fully desegregate schools, it was the first major step towards racial equality. At this point, Thurgood Marshall was considered one of the most successful and well-known lawyers in America. In 1955, Thurgood's wife of 25 years would pass away from cancer, having lived to see him make this great achievement. Thurgood marries his Filipino secretary at the NAACP, Cecilia Suyat, with whom he would have 2 sons. When there was talk of this interracial marriage, Thurgood was quoted as saying, "I don't care what people think, I'm marrying you." In 1961, President John F. Kennedy appoints Thurgood Marshall as a judge to the U.S. Second Circuit Court of Appeals, during which time Marshall issued over 100 decisions, none of which was overturned by the Supreme Court. Then, in 1965, he was appointed to serve as the first black U.S. Solicitor General by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The prestigious position of Solicitor General is the attorney designated to argue on behalf of the federal government before the Supreme Court. During his 2 years as Solicitor General, Marshall won 14 of the 19 cases that he argued before the Supreme Court.
When John W. Davis had made the point putting all these children together because of their varying abilities would bring shockwaves, he said, there's no problem with that. Just put the dumb colored kids with the dumb white kids and put the smart colored kids with the smart white kids.
With such a stellar record, President Johnson nominates Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court in 1967. On October 2, 1967, Marshall was sworn in as a Supreme Court Justice, becoming the first African American justice ever to serve on the Supreme Court, our country's highest court. Over the next 6 years, while sitting on a liberal-leaning Supreme Court led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, Marshall continued to support rulings which upheld his belief in the protection of individual rights. He was known for his liberal views and protection of the voiceless, as he consistently ruled liberally over controversial social issues. Justice Marshall was part of the majority that ruled in favor of a woman's right to abortion in the landmark case Roe v. Wade in 1973. He also ruled against the death penalty, writing his opinion that it was unconstitutional in all circumstances. The decision on the 1972 case Furman v. Georgia led to a moratorium on the death penalty for some years. For the remainder of Marshall's tenure on the Supreme Court, 8 consecutive justices were nominated by Republican presidents, leading to an increasingly conservative court, and leaving him a minority as a liberal. His ability to find rulings which aligned with his liberal views diminished, forcing him to resort to writing dissents expressing his disagreements with many future rulings. This included the Supreme Court reinstating the death penalty and limiting affirmative action measures and abortion rights. In 1991, Thurgood Marshall retired from the Supreme Court at the age of 82. He was replaced by Justice Clarence Thomas, who is also African American. Thurgood Marshall died on January 24, 1993 of heart failure at the age of 84, leaving his widow and 2 sons, but also a legacy for all who have ever been discriminated against. The Thurgood Marshall Scholarship Fund was set up to benefit public historically black colleges and universities. It is an undisputable fact that Thurgood Marshall's landmark case, Brown v. the Board of Education in 1954, paved the way for the American Civil Rights Movement. It was the catalyst that would begin the decade of struggle to right civil injustice. Marshall was considered one of the 3 leaders of the Civil Rights Revolution, but the least well known. In the company of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, each contributed something different to the cause. Martin Luther King Jr. was an eloquent speaker who inspired and motivated the movement. Malcolm X was a separatist who touted violence as a means, but arguably, Thurgood Marshall offered a third option, using the court judicial system to change the laws and make change happen peacefully.
For many people, it was unimaginable that segregation would come to an end or could come to an end as a result of litigation. So you had to tell them, that's what the law is, that's what it ought to be, and that's what we can get for you.
He recognized that using the law to effect change in the United States and to effect civil liberties and civil rights was the key to success. He was working within the system.